Welcome to DesignOps Island Discs, the podcast from Zero Height that navigates the calm waters of DesignOps with your host, me, Luke Murphy. I'm a design advocate at Zero Height, and I'm talking to the best folks in DesignOps and design systems to navigate us through what it takes to float DesignOps and design systems within your design org. So for episode 3 of season 3, which is being recorded live and in person, I'm joined by Amy Hupe. So Amy is a I'm sure she doesn't need an introduction, but she is a content specialist and design systems consultant who has worked on design systems at places like GovUK, BT, Babylon Health, and most recently Springer Nature. And she speaks around the world on design systems, inclusivity, contribution, content, and lots of other things. She's also got one of the most prolific blogs, I think, ever at amyhupe.co.uk. She's also the first return guest on this podcast. So welcome back to the podcast and to my living room, Amy.
Thank you so much. Should we talk about why I'm back on the podcast?
Well, okay.
There was begging.
Yes, there was begging involved. I mean, it was. So obviously for season 3, we are trying to talk to all the different roles within design systems and design ops so that we can kind of get a good shared understanding of what all these roles do. Content was always high on my list. And I just thought, no, I can't ask Amy to come after having been on stage at Converge, having been on the webinar, after being at my other conference, WDC. I thought, really, can I ask you again to do it? But you were begging to come back on. So
yeah, what actually happened is you WhatsApped me saying, do I know anyone who's working as a content designer at Design Systems that could be on the podcast? Which I found so deeply hurtful.
Well, I mean,
and then I begged and then I offered to pay.
Yeah.
And then here I am, but I didn't have to pay, so that was nice.
Yeah, no, there's no payment involved here. It's
No.
just to be completely above board.
Yeah.
But yes, no, that is very true. That is very true.
Sorry.
But I should provide context next time. So for those who don't know Amy's path into design systems, I definitely recommend going back and listening to that episode on season 1. It is very, very good. Talk about the problems with contribution in design systems. So I think instead of doing the treading over old territory again, we can probably just dive straight into the questions. We don't have any
costume. Yeah.
So, I mean, I feel like content does go by a lot of names within design systems. So, content specialist, content designer. I've even heard content people be called community managers, which I think is a completely different job, but that's another question. But I just wanted to get from you what you see the role of content design and content in design systems actually being.
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, I think the reason that it has so many different names, that's not something that's unique to design systems. I think that's true of content professionals in general. And there's lots of arguing on Twitter about what the differences between a content designer and a UX writer and a tech writer and a tech comms specialist, and some of them were doing it in the 90s. So yeah, so I think it probably depends slightly on what the kind of focus is for a content person. I guess the reality is a lot of the time content people are spread very thinly, if they exist at all, on design system teams. So it's likely that they might be working across all the things I'm about to mention. But I guess if you've got a content designer who, like me, tends to be more focused on documentation and guidance, then you might call them a content designer, but you might call them a tech writer, because a lot of what they're doing is developer documentation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Alternatively, you might have a content designer working on a design system that's more focused on what I think of as the sort of content elements of our systems themselves.
Yeah. So it's UX writers, right?
Yeah, button labels and form labels and error messages and other things that appear in our UI. And then you'll have content designers that work across all of those things. But typically I've tended to focus on the content kind of within the system itself. So the guidance that tells people how to use the system, than the stuff that gets used as part of the system.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I find it interesting because content is nowhere near as prolific as it should be, right?
No.
We were just going through the numbers before we started recording from the How We Document survey, which we put out last year, and we're actually just closing it off this week. Plug for anybody who hasn't filled it in, especially if you're in content design. So last year it was 18% of teams had content in their design systems teams, which is actually higher than I thought it was going to be. It was less than 1% of people actually filled out the survey who were in content. This year, from the numbers that we have in currently, so obviously we've still got a few days, but 23% of teams have content, which is a good jump up. And
yeah, you ruined the fact that I was going to pretend that I had these numbers in my head. That's fine. Don't worry about it.
I'm sorry. I just ruined it completely.
You did, but we worked out, didn't we, that if we carried on at this rate, I think we'd have a content designer on every design system team by the year 2050 something.
Yeah. I think that's about right. Well, I mean, we can wait that long, can't we?
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
but this is
I don't know if the world can wait that long, but yeah.
This is the interesting thing, because I do feel like I know I've been, when I talk about the important roles to have on design systems, and obviously most people talk about engineering and design to begin with. Sometimes people throw in product as well, but I do really feel like content is that sort of third pillar.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly I'm biased. I think it's really, really important to have content designers working on design system teams, because as with kind of any product, how you communicate it and how you set up that sort of relationship with your audience, I think is so important. And content designers are, what they specialize in is finding the right balance. And it's about finding balance between how much detail do you give people, how do you tailor your message to different audiences, how do you communicate the work that you're doing, give people compelling reasons to use it. And I think that stuff is so often overlooked. And one of the biggest problems that I hear from, the organizations that I work with is people don't really understand our design system. Our stakeholders don't know what a design system does. People think design systems are going to stifle their creativity. And it's always a communication issue. And I think working with content designers can really help with that. So to me, it feels really, really important. But I think it's a general problem. Content design is undervalued and underrepresented,
especially in product.
Yeah.
I feel like in marketing, it's like it's more likely that you'll have content people on the marketing side of the business, but within product, I remember. I don't think I've ever worked in a product org. This is damning, so don't go on my LinkedIn and call these companies out. But I don't think I've ever worked in a product org that had content writers on the product side or content specialists on the product side. And so what ended up happening was the designers would quite often write the content.
Yeah, and I think that you kind of hit the nail on the head with like a big problem here, which is that we're all sort of taught how to communicate using words from a very young age. So we're taught to speak and read and write. And for that reason, I think a lot of people have this perception that, I know how to do that. I can do this well. I don't need a specialist to teach me how to do it. But like anything, it's a skill. And I think that it's one that part of our kind of role as content designers is to kind of advocate for and explain to people why what we do is a specialism, even though it's something that everybody, if you think about something like programming, there's a hard barrier there. Like I couldn't just start writing code. I mean, I could, but probably wouldn't do anything. But you could just start writing words, and how good those words are or not. I don't know, Luke, I haven't read any of your writing recently, but I think that's a challenge that we always have with content design, is how to communicate that it is a specialism, it is a skill.
It is. And I mean, so I actually have a background in content before I got into design.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. I just needed to, mention that.
Yeah.
No, but it does mean that it was something that really surprised me, because it was an assumption that I made was everybody could write.
Yeah.
And everybody could write well. And working with a lot of people has shown me that is not always the case. Some people are naturally gifted with it. Some people just don't have that part. But it's exactly what you're saying. Like, it's design, I think, has a similar problem where it's, a lot of, especially senior leadership, tend to think that they can do a lot of design thinking and the design, solving the problems. When it's like, actually, these people are specialists at their jobs. They're experts in what they do. Why would you give this to somebody who that isn't their expertise and that isn't their specialism?
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting, because I think that's actually one of the biggest benefits of having a kind of not a non-subject matter expert content designer working in your design system team, because I think it's something that Caroline Jarrett, I don't know if you know her, she's a form specialist and consultant. And
CJ Forms on Twitter, right?
CJ Forms on Twitter. Oh, she's an absolute legend. But one of the things that she says, I find myself quoting a lot of the time, is now I'm going to misquote it, but something along the lines of, if you know it well enough to say that it's correct, then you know it too well to say that it's clear. And I think that that's really, really key. So like, you might be a fantastic writer, but not you, but you might be working on a design system team listening to this, and you might be a fantastic writer, But the closer that you are to the subject matter that you're writing about, the harder it is to judge whether you're going to be able to communicate that clearly to an audience that isn't a subject matter expert.
Yeah.
And I think that's where content professionals really sort of come into their own in design system teams, because we can be that step removed. We can look at things more objectively and say, is this clear? And we know what processes to go through with our users and with the people that are using the design system to kind of understand that, and to how to ask the right questions to make a judgment about whether we're communicating it sufficiently.
So that's really interesting. So you would actually suggest not having subject matter experts as content people, or at least having a mix of people. Well, we all know that diverse backgrounds are good generally in all ways.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be a little careful here, because I feel that I'm now a subject matter expert and a content designer selling my services to organizations who I hope will still continue to hire me after this conversation. So, but I do think it helps. Yeah, I mean, I think in the early days of working in design systems, I felt really out of my depth for a while. I'm really like, I don't understand what's going on here. None of this makes any sense to me. I don't know what you're talking about. How can I work on this thing that I don't understand? And actually, I sort of grew to understand that that was a strength, because it allowed me to sort of see things and to ask questions that the people in my team were not necessarily asking and weren't picking up on. I mean, I think a good content designer, even if they have a certain amount of topical knowledge, will be able to still kind of spot the signs that something has crossed the line into incomprehensible.
Yeah.
But yeah, I certainly think that can be a strength if somebody doesn't have subject matter expertise, but they're really good at their discipline.
Yeah.
Don't not hire them because they haven't worked on a design system before.
It's actually, it's, I think that's amazing advice, and it's really interesting. And it's also, I think it's, even the awareness of it as well. If you do have the subject matter expertise, having that awareness, can sometimes help go a little bit of the way. So I'm interested as well. So obviously you think that design system teams should have content people. How early do you think they should?
Day one, day zero.
Yeah.
I mean, the earlier the better from my point of view. And I know it's not the reality, so I kind of want to acknowledge the reality. And it's like that thing, isn't it? That thing that I can't remember where it came from. I want to say it's a Chinese proverb, and I might be wrong. And I'm really sorry if it's not a Chinese proverb and I'm being very unkind. But it's the thing about the tree. So like the best time to plant a tree is now, and the best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago, and the second best time is now.
Yeah.
And I think that that's how I feel about content designers. It's like, hire one from day one if you can, and you probably didn't do that. And a lot of organizations are already on their design system journey at this point. So I don't want people to hear that and think, oh,
we missed the boat.
We missed the boat. Yeah. It's like any time, as soon as you can, basically. But the earlier that you get a content designer involved in your design system, I guess the less rework for a content designer to come in and do, because, I've been that person that's kind of come in when a design system's been going for a year or so. And often there's a lot of unpicking to be done. Like there's a lot of rework of the kind of information architecture, and there's a lot of research to do that teams maybe feel they've already done, but hasn't been done from a content lens.
Yeah.
So I guess it's just more efficient to have a content designer from day one. And I think it'll help them to be more effective and deliver more value for you if you can get them involved earlier. But if you didn't, don't let that stop you from doing it now.
Yeah. I mean, I assumed that was going to be the answer, so that's good. And now I can keep parroting that and
predictable,
pretending it's my answer. So that's good. What do you see as the main challenges in design systems? Especially, I'm interested from a content perspective, whether there are any specific challenges. I know that you do talk a lot about structured content, and I suppose it's not a challenge, it's more of an opportunity area that a lot of people aren't doing anything with.
Yeah, definitely. Oh my God. So I had an answer in my head, and then you threw that into the mix.
Sorry.
And now I have two. So I think there's two things, actually. So one thing that I kind of keep coming up against with organizations that I talk to and that I work with is now that design systems are perhaps a little more established and better known, even outside of the kind of design system practitioner bubble, I think that that's great in many ways, because it means they're getting funded and they're getting supported. But the downside is that a lot of people now have kind of preconceptions about design systems, and not all of those are correct. So I think, one really common thing is the idea that design systems are just this kind of point in time thing that you introduce to an organization, and then they're suddenly able to support all of your digital infrastructure. And that you need to get to that point as quickly as possible. So you need to quickly stop any kind of duplication of effort, introduce a design system, make sure we're only ever doing things once forevermore. And we kind of work towards that point in time and kind of act as if nothing else counts. But actually, the way that I see it now is it's over time, we're reducing a duplication of effort. We're reducing inefficiencies in our processes. And that happens gradually. And we're never going to have done it, but it's something that we have to sort of slowly work at over time. And design systems are useful from the moment that you set up a team or that you start working on one, and they just become more useful over time. And I think that communicating that is really challenging. And I think that that's a real kind of challenge for content people working on design systems, because a lot of the stuff that we write about them, like on our documentation websites, in our blog posts that we write about them, in our actual documentation and guidance, needs to kind of reflect that. So that's a kind of a broad challenge, but one that I think relates to content design.
Interesting, yeah.
But I'm going to reject that. I'm going to talk about that somewhere else. I'm going to move into the structured content thing, because I think it's so interesting and such an untapped opportunity. And I think you spoke to Chase McCoy about this on the podcast before.
I would highly recommend. I'm pretty sure it's episode 6 of season 1.
Yeah. I didn't listen to that for quite a long time after it came out, even though you said I should.
I told you to.
And then I got a plug on it, and I was so delighted with that. I was like, why didn't I listen to that earlier? But Chase has written some really interesting stuff about this and spoke about it on the podcast. But the challenge let me describe the problem. So basically, if you think about guidance within your design system and where that best sits, let's take an example that I'm looking at right now, which is like write using sentence case, write calls to action using sentence case. So that's like one piece of guidance. And if we think about where that guidance is relevant, it's relevant for button labels. It's relevant for link text. It's potentially relevant to a set of content guidelines. It's potentially relevant in your documentation website, but maybe also places like Figma if you want to have some embedded documentation, maybe also places like Storybook if you want your developers to see that documentation. So we've got multiple platforms and also multiple contexts in which our guidance is relevant. And that's just one example, but pretty much everything that you look at will be relevant in more than one place. So a challenge that I'm kind of often thinking about is how can we build and structure design system documentation in a way that it's maintainable? Because bear in mind, we've talked about how underrepresented content people are on design system teams. And they're the people that have to think about how to maintain this stuff in a way that is sustainable for them and for the team. So if you've got less than one content design person per design system team, and you're not thinking about this stuff, then you're kind of unconsciously creating this huge maintenance overhead, because you have to publish that guidance in all those different places, have a separate instance of it in all those different places, and then somehow keep track of it all and make sure that it's all in sync.
Yep.
And it's like the whole point of our work on design systems is to try and tackle this problem when it comes to the way that we build our user experiences. But for some reason, we don't apply that mindset to content. So I'm really interested in the opportunities that come with looking at applying a kind of structured data approach to our content in design systems, so that we can help to reduce some of the inefficiency that we claim to hate.
Well, it's turning design system document. It's exactly what you said. It's using the principles of design systems, of building things into their smallest components and then building up from there, right?
Yeah.
And having them contextual, that you could then apply to your document. It makes so much sense. And I remember when Chase said it to me, it was like a aha moment. But I think one of the problems at the moment is that to build this is not particularly easy.
No, it's really complicated. And what was fascinating to me when I started kind of digging around in this area is that nobody's doing it really. So Chase is working at Stripe, and they're doing some really interesting experimentation with it.
Yeah.
But I think Chase would admit, like, they're nowhere near sort of cracking it, as it were.
They're scratching the surface. It's the same as the work that he did on Seeds with Sprout Social. There's small elements of the concept of related content, but nothing yet quite at that level. And I think there's even a few tools that have, again, touched it. I know that we at Zero Height, not a plug for Zero Height, Well, plug for Zero Height.
It is Zero Heights podcast, right?
It is Zero Heights
So
podcast.
probably should plug them a bit.
But we have synced pages as a concept because we found that, people across style guides, which is just the very first step of a concept of taking it where it's like a single thing that you can reuse elsewhere. I know that, Notion, which is, obviously more of a just note-taking tool, but they've introduced the concept of synced blocks, where you can have a single block that is synced across multiple places. There's some really interesting challenges with it that it's going to be interesting to see how
there's really interesting challenges with it. And I think what's one of the biggest challenges is the kind of landscape of tooling that we use in this space. So most design system teams that I've encountered anyway use a mixture of sort of custom and proprietary tooling to kind of compose their design systems. So, the one I'm working on right now, we have a custom built documentation website. We use GitHub. We use Sketch. Okay, we're using Sketch right now. And at some point we may look at Figma. But yeah, and that's just, and that's one of the kind of simpler tool stacks that I've encountered with design systems. Often you might be using, at a conservative guess, like 5 to 7 different tools to sort of build and document your design system. So how you create some kind of structured content model for your documentation that can then work in that landscape of all this complexity, and a lot of it where we don't control the APIs, it's a really hard thing, and that landscape is also always changing. So but I do think we need to solve this problem, because there are those that say, although I'm not sure I subscribe to this, that documentation sites are potentially becoming less of the sort of landing point than they were. So I think maybe 5 years back, for most design system teams, a documentation website was the
artifact.
It
was
the artifact. It was the thing that
yeah.
was what people meant when they said our design system. Whereas now I'm seeing a lot less emphasis on putting everything in a documentation site and more emphasis on meeting people where they are. So putting developer documentation in developer tools and design documentation in design tools, and maybe a kind of remix of our usage guidance in those places.
Yeah.
So I think this is a really, really important problem to solve. And I think if we're not starting to solve it now, we could find ourselves in a bit of hot water in a few years' time.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I know that it's something that we've been talking a lot about internally at Zero Height.
Yeah.
I know that we're going to run out of time. I'm going to let time get away from me, so I might just move on to the last official question of the podcast, the most important one, which we have already had one answer, but you can't remember it, so you're going to have to make something up. And then we'll get on to the audience questions. So before we send you off to your desert island, Amy, you get to take one book, one album or song, and one luxury item to take with you to make your days on the island just that little bit more comfortable.
Okay. What was great is that I didn't realize I was going to have to answer this again, and you told me that 2 minutes before we started recording.
I did, because I mean that way.
So did I have an answer? Okay, so the book that I would take is actually one I read quite recently, which is Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart.
Ooh.
And I just love it. It's all about kind of emotions and how they relate to each other, and it's backed up by loads of research, and it's just so interesting. It's like, I think there's something so powerful in like giving names to all those weird feelings that you thought only you had, but actually lots of other people have as well. And yeah, loads of really fascinating insights in there, and I just feel like my emotions would probably go a bit wild if I was on a desert island, so it'd be nice to have something to reference. And you
can memorize all of the different emotions, the names for all of them, so that you can accurately diagnose yourself at any one point
as you slowly descend into kind of madness. So that and then I guess, what was the other thing? Luxury item, a hot water bottle.
Ooh,
I mean, it might be hot on a desert island, but it's going to get cold at night, and I am famously someone that carries a hot water bottle with me in all weathers at all times. So I think I'd have that. And album wise, I'd take your album, Luke.
Oh,
you're
no,
aren't you?
Don't do that. We're not going to talk about that. That was
a little plug. Go on.
I have a feeling that this was just that feels weird now. I'm going to move on to the audience questions. We're called Brute Alligators. I'm going to edit that out later.
Amazing.
Okay, so we're going to move across to the Q&A section before we do the final I seem to be joined by my colleague Connie there for a second, which is quite exciting. All right. So we've got some good questions from folks. I don't have names attached to it, so apologies, but thank you very much if you've asked a question, and thank you doubly if we actually get to ask it on the podcast. So you refer to product. Well, I mean, this one's a nice, easy one. When you're talking about product, do you mean digital product, physical product, or both? I'm guessing you're talking about digital products mostly.
Well, you're the one that said product, so
was I?
You were, but I would be primarily focused on digital products, although design systems can.
I was going to say
cover both.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Have you worked on any design systems that have covered both?
I've worked on some design systems that threatened to, but we never got that far.
Because I'd really love to see some examples, and I'd really love if anybody has some good examples in the chat to share some examples of ones that do cover off physical. The closest I've seen is, I know Decathlon have their design system, and they cover off a lot of the like in-store branding stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of, but I want to see a good hardware design system.
Have a look at the Co-op Experience Library.
Okay.
I don't know how far they've got with it, but I know that the intention, and one of the reasons they didn't call it a design system, even though that's what it is, Co-op, is because the intention was to cover kind of their in-store and what do Co-op do? In-store and
they do everything. They
everything,
do funeral care. They're a bank.
Basically.
They do basically everything. Well, it's interesting actually. I mean, this isn't one of the questions, but let's get into it now.
Sure.
I assumed that they called it the Experience Library because they wanted to get away from the term design system because it's a loaded term.
They did, but I think that was one of the ways that they felt it was loaded, was that design systems bring to mind kind of digital products.
Yes.
And they wanted to think beyond that. And also, some of the connotations that come with design systems.
Well, design owns design systems, right? This is a very important debate to have, isn't it?
No, I don't. I'm sick of it. I don't. It's fine. The name is fine. Sorry, Co-op. I respect what you're doing. And I also think the name design system is fine. And I think that we're putting too much of the burden on a single term. I think actually it's more about how we communicate them and explain them. A term is never going to describe the whole concept and all the complexity that goes with something like a design system.
But you don't think a product system is better?
No.
Okay, we'll get back to the questions now.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the overlap between, well, actually this is an interesting one. Do you think that there is any overlap between product marketing and content design in design systems?
Oh God, I never know how to answer this because yes, I do is the answer. And in a dream world, we'd all be working together in one big happy content design system-y family, and all this stuff would form part of the same system, because I think marketing forms part of the user experience. And so content should be thought of as kind of something that spans both of those things. But I think the reality is, in all the organizations I've worked in, marketing has sat very separately from the teams that are designing their kind of digital product experience.
Yeah.
And so in theory and in practice, I think you're going to struggle to get marketing to use your design system. And I'd be really interested if anybody has found that to not be the case. So I was very excited because I could see someone in all caps saying agree to the thing I just said about not changing the term design system. So thank you very much. I love you.
It's really interesting. The whole marketing, especially marketing content and the product content, it is something, because we've been talking to a lot of teams, and there is always that desire, especially with bigger organizations. They want to bring in the marketing team there because they want to, solidify everything and put it all into one single place because it's cheaper that way. But they do have a lot of trouble doing that. But it's interesting because it's like, it is all just the one experience, right? Like it should be just the one experience.
It's all part of the one experience, isn't it? I mean, I guess the purpose is different. Like marketing is there to promote and sell products, and product copy is usually there to try and disappear into the background and create kind of a seamless experience through a product. But yeah, I mean, when you think about the experience that a customer has or a user has of your service or product, do they distinguish between the two? Do they distinguish between the moment that they see an advert to the moment that they've bought the product? Or do they see that all as part of the same engagement with the same company? And I suspect it's the latter. So Yeah, I think that there is overlap, and that probably should be dealt with better than it is today. But in kind of practical terms, organizations are usually structured in such a way that marketing and product sits separately.
Yeah.
And I guess design systems kind of have to support the context that they're being set up in.
And I suppose this is related then. Do you think that it's one of the questions that I did originally have for the main part of the podcast, not the Q&A, but it's related to this, because do you think that there is a specific, so it sounds like you think there's definitely a specific skill set needed to do product copy compared to marketing copy or comms copy. I mean, is that fair?
I do think it's fair. But I'm not closed-minded about that. I'd be very interested to hear from anybody who's like, well, I do this full set of things and I think I, use the same skills to do them all. But I say that because I've been asked to do marketing jobs. So like my role is like I'm a content design and design systems consultant. So sometimes mostly I do kind of design system focused engagements, but sometimes I do purely sort of content design things. Yeah. And some of the kind of client queries I've had is like, can you come and do some marketing copy for us? And I'm like, no, that's not my skill set. That's not what I do. And I've had a go for companies before and I'm not sure how it went. It certainly felt like much harder work for me because it's not what I'm used to. So I do think it's a slightly different skill set. Yeah. And I think actually a lot of the stuff that we do when we're writing kind of marketing copy is stuff that we sort of shy away from when we're writing product copy.
It's having an understanding of UX principles and the concept behind UX, of making the experience better for the user. Whereas quite often marketing copy is not really it's thinking about the user, but in a very different way, not trying to make their life easier, more trying to get in the way a bit more. But it's interesting because I mean, this is a topic for another day, but I actually feel like for a lot of marketing copywriters as well, having sort of the foundations of UX principles in your arsenal is actually a really important thing, because it's understanding the users is a key part to getting them to do what you want to do. Because that, like, in a very crass way, that is what anybody from designers to, content people, that's what we're trying to do in the end. We're trying to get the user to do something that we want them to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point. And actually I went to the Leading Design Conference in London last week, and I'm so sorry, I can't remember whose talk it was. We were talking about this before we came on. I've got really bad post-COVID brain fog at the moment, and I'm finding I can remember all the talks and I can remember all the speakers, but I can't put them together in my mind. So it's like somebody said that basically in design, we tend to, in like UX design specifically, we tend to kind of almost like sneer at people who are kind of working in marketing or in like growth teams or in sort of more like corporate, business strategy focused teams. And actually those people are our kind of closest allies. Like we're all trying to achieve the same thing. They have really important insights to share with us and us with them. And we have to learn to work with them better. And it was such a kind of good point. And I think that we should sort of take stock of that as people working on design systems too. But sadly, I do not remember whose talk it was, but it was very good. And they were all very good. And if the talks get published, you should watch all of them to find out which one it was.
I don't think they do, sadly. So I'm curious. Okay, so different skills. So we have established that basically different skill set between marketing and product copy. Do you think there is a different skill set if you're wanting to be in content in design systems?
To content in general?
Yeah, or like content within product more widely.
I think there are some specific skills that help there. And I would say probably the main one, unless you've kind of tended to specialize in more technical products, is just the ability to get comfortable with not really knowing the subject matter, and to work with people who won't necessarily be used to communicating to people outside of their kind of practice. So I think that feels really important to me, and it does. I think it's more of a perceived barrier than an actual one. Like a lot of the time I talk to content designers who are interested in moving into this space, and they're like, oh, but I don't really understand code, and I don't, I'm not a developer, and I've never worked with developers before. And it's like, that's kind of not a problem, but what you have to get good at is having confidence in your skills, that you can find a path forward, even though you don't necessarily understand what's being said and what's being, and you don't have to, but you have to be comfortable with not having to. And I think that that's maybe one of the kind of hardest things. But I think content designers in general are brilliant systems thinkers. Like naturally, they might not identify like that, but I think that they are. It's part of the kind of skill set of content design to think about, to zoom out, think about the whole system and the whole context in which your content is kind of appearing, and what happens before and after somebody accesses your content, and the different kind of routes into it and the routes out of it. And I think to do that well, you have to be a good systems thinker. So I think it's such a kind of natural match, content design and design systems, but I just don't think that's recognized at the kind of level that I wish it was.
Well, I mean, as we saw, only 23% of teams.
100% of teams by 2050.
2050 is when we should be aiming for.
I now think we might have got that wrong.
No, I think
it's 5% a year for 77. Anyway,
this
isn't interesting.
Maths isn't really a strong point, is it?
Edit this out. It's not great.
Okay, so I have some more questions here.
Yeah.
And if anybody has any more questions that they want to hear, there are a few here that are Zero Height specific. So I'm going to see if I can answer those after the fact, because it's probably not interesting to everybody else. So if you could, well, actually, here I'm curious about this. What piece of advice when you started your career? How did you start your career?
Oh, how early do you want me to go back?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking like first real job.
Well, my first, I'm going to just tell you my first job, because it's actually quite interesting. It was just down the road from here, and it was in the hairdresser that looks like it's a front for a drug business. And I can confirm is. So I started there kind of sweeping hair off the floor.
Wow.
But I'll skip forward a bit because probably you don't want to hear every.
Yeah, no, I don't want to hear about your time in Sainsbury's.
So when I started my sort of career proper, was Waitrose actually. Was I worked for Which, the Consumers Association.
Yeah.
And I was desperate to be I either wanted to work in their investigative journalism team or in their policy and advocacy team. And I ended up doing neither for a very long time. So I kind of went and worked in their call center and then applied for their grad scheme, and I didn't get onto it.
Oh.
So then I know, really sad time.
Egg on their face now.
I cried. Egg on their face now. But then a few weeks later, they hired me for an internship in a paid internship as well, because they're very fair. In their London office, and I went to work as a kind of research assistant person doing research and writing. I wrote a news story about sleep and whether cheese affects your sleep, and I actually interviewed a professor of sleep whose number I still have in my phone. It's the weirdest number I have in my phone.
Wow.
About that. So sorry,
pretty good.
Probably too much detail.
Well, no, that's totally fine. Well, I'm curious. So if you had any advice for when you started your career, is there a piece of advice that you wish somebody told you?
I think just follow your nose and figure out what feels good, like sort of abandon the plan if that starts to feel like the right thing to do. Because as I say, so my plan was either go and work in like policy and advocacy or go and work in investigative journalism, and that never quite I started with the journalism a little bit, but then I ended up sort of taking a sidestep into the digital operations team, which is how I ended up eventually, I think, moving into design systems. And that really felt great for me. But there were moments, I think, where I was like, oh, this isn't the plan, and I remember when I interviewed for GDS as a content designer, and my plan was, go and work on the GovUK team. And then they sort of put me on the design system team. And I remember just thinking, what am I doing? Like, this is so far from what I set out to do. This actually sounds quite boring.
Yeah.
But it's, I need a change, and it's a change. And someone that I know works at GDS and they say it's nice and everything. And it ended up just being the best thing. Like, I ended up really loving it and becoming, if you can't tell, like an incredible nerd about this.
Oh yeah,
subject.
It's all you talk about.
It's literally all I talk about. We've been out for like non-work related beers, and that's all I've talked about all night,
pretty much.
And I think that's what I would say. It's like, just don't be afraid to abandon the plan. If you start to find something that you love, then just keep going after it, and don't worry about whether that fits with your kind of grand career plan, I think.
As somebody who started as a web admin, and got offered to do some of the design work and some of the web design stuff as well on the side. Just if you have time to do it, which then ended up as a very sort of, via about 5 other roles into product design and design. I mean, I completely agree. It's take the opportunities that are given, and
and enjoy them.
Yeah, definitely. I'm probably going to regret this question, working at Zero Height, but good question from Sarah. As a content specialist, what have been the most useful tools when it comes to documentation?
Oh, not Zero Height. I'm joking. I haven't been asked to plug this or say anything, but I think there's a lot to be said for just so many teams. I think that they have to build a custom documentation site and just use what's out there. Like, depending on what kind of resource you have, like, you might need one, but the best way to find out if you need a custom solution is to try an off-the-shelf thing and find out what it doesn't do for you. I think that's a really good way to answer that question for yourself. So I would say, don't be afraid to use off-the-shelf tools like Zero Height, or even things like Notion, work for some teams. In terms of what's been the most useful tool, I mean, this is a hard one. I'd actually say, for me, learning Git and learning how to use GitHub has been really valuable, because it allows me to work more closely with developers. And I think when you're a sort of non-technical person working in this space, any kind of now I feel like I'm doing that thing of saying you should bake cookies for your team to make friends, which I'm not. But I do think any kind of currency that you have helps, and knowing how to use some developer tools helps. And it also puts you more in control as well. So, I don't have to wait for a developer to publish a change to our documentation site via GitHub. I can just go in and do that myself. And that's a really empowering thing. So I think it's certainly not the most useful and intuitive tool. Anyone that's tried to use Git will know how frustrating it is at times. But I think that learning how to use it is a real asset. So I suppose that's a bit of a half answer to that question.
No, I think that's a really good suggestion. I'd like to add one, if that's okay.
No.
Thank you. One that I found, actually, which is a small. So I'm a really big fan of using purpose-built tools as well, small tools. And I mean, this one isn't that small, but Grammarly.
Yeah.
Grammarly, especially when you get into their sort of paid tiers, and when you can set up basically your own style guide references that then whilst you're actually writing documentation or writing anything, will give you the prompts to change the things that are based around your particular style guide and how you write things. It forces my team to actually use Oxford commas, which I love, but you can set up really specific things. I'm not paid by Grammarly here, but it's one of those, I really love tools that do a single thing really well.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I suppose on that note, like, another way to do that is to actually build kind of content and grammar rules and style rules into your linter. And that's where, again, I think having close relationship with your developers is really, really helpful, because a lot of the time content designers and developers are like the furthest apart on a multidisciplinary product team. It's like we focus on content designers working with other designers and designers working with developers, but rarely do we kind of hop across the designers and have content designers and developers working together. And actually, I think they've got so much to offer each other. So
I think that makes sense.
Took us off on a big tangent there, didn't I? Sorry.
That's okay. That's great. I think we have time for one more question before we wrap things up today. And there's a great one here. It is from an anonymous person. So thank you, whoever asked this. Big question. What makes someone a good systems thinker?
I thought you were going to ask me the one below that about Ditto, and I've never heard of it.
Never used Ditto, so I don't know. Yeah,
I don't know. But yeah. So, what makes a good systems thinker? What do they do? What things do they think about? Oh God, I mean, read Donella Meadows.
Okay.
Thinking. Oh my God, the name's gone out of my head.
Isn't it called Thinking in Systems? Yes.
I think it is. Yeah. Thinking in systems, because I suspect that you'll recognize that you're already doing, I think people that are interested in design systems and content design tend to be pretty good systems thinkers, and they just might not know it. So I think read that and you'll probably recognize a lot of your own skills in there already.
Yeah.
But I think broadly speaking, it's about people who can think about things in a non-linear way.
Yeah.
So not just a user journey that begins the minute somebody becomes aware of your product and ends when they offboard, but thinking that there's lots of different routes and experiences that people can have within that, that kind of cross over each other, and just basic thinking about kind of cause and effect. Like, you'd be amazed at how many people don't do that, and I think it's just that a lot of the things that comprise systems thinking are not really complicated, and a lot of us do it just without thinking on our day-to-day lives. But yeah, I think it's about people who can, I think that kind of non-linear thing is really crucial for me. It's about people who can see different sort of aspects of whatever it is, a piece of content or a design system, and all the different faces and all the different journeys that make it up. I think that felt like quite a waffly answer to end on.
No, I think that's quite good. I think the other one that I've seen, and it's interesting because I think it's used as, speaking of waffly answers, I think it's used as like a waffle patter for any CV. Attention to detail. It's one of those things that
I'll scrub that from my CV after this.
Well, I'm curious because it's something that I've always had on my CV is attention to detail. What I've discovered is actually I'm pretty terrible with attention to detail. Thanks, ADHD. But it is one of those things that I do find that people who do well with systems thinking and do well on design systems tend to have that willingness to just spend that extra. They really want to get in the weeds and really hyper focus on something.
Yeah, I would say if anybody's ever called you an overthinker, you're probably a very good systems thinker.
Yeah. Whereas if you're the kind of person who likes to start a project and then has a graveyard of dead projects, just stick to product.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, for joining. We can do the proper podcast outro now, and I can edit it in seamlessly after the fact for people who didn't join us live.
Amazing.
So thank you, Amy, for joining us on DesignOps Island Discs. Thank you to the lovely audience for your questions. We'll now set Amy afloat off to her desert island so that she can accurately diagnose every problem that she has. You can find Amy on Twitter at Amy_Hupe. Is still your Twitter? Do you have a Mastodon yet?
I do. Oh God, I do. Yeah, I do have a Mastodon, and I'm the same at Mastodon. I think I'm Mastodon Social.
Brilliant. And as I mentioned before, I would highly recommend going and checking out amyhupe.co.uk. The articles that Amy produces are phenomenal. Amazing reading. I devour them whenever she posts them. She'll also be speaking at Clarity in a few days.
Yay, I am speaking. I keep forgetting because I pre-recorded my talk because it's a hybrid conference this year, but I'm doing a live Q&A, and yeah, I'm very, very excited.
Which is on the first day or the second day?
First day. So the Thursday. Yeah. So this is like my Glastonbury. I'm very excited.
Brilliant. And anything else you've got coming up?
I'm speaking at the Gov UK Design Systems Day on Tuesday, but I think it's sold out. So unless you're going, sorry.
Oh, damn. But it's okay. I'm sure that they might put some of those live later.
I suspect they will. It's taxpayers' money, isn't it?
Yeah.
If they're not, that's really embarrassing now, but I think they will.
And if they don't, then definitely go and have a look at the Zero Height YouTube. You can find Amy's talk from Converge on there, which I'm pretty sure we're releasing directly very soon. And if not, you can go to convergeldn.com and you can sign up there to get the videos sent directly to you. I'd also recommend checking out her WDC talk as well, which is the same talk that you're doing at the Gov UK conference.
Yeah.
So
building conscious design systems.
So that will be released next week, I believe, on the WebDevConf YouTube channel. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Zero Height, the design system documentation and management platform. You can jump in at any point and create your first style guide for free by heading over to zeroheight.com/podcast. If you put the /podcast on, it means that my bosses know that I sent you along there. And I don't know, I might get some cookies.
Might get that £17 back that I paid you to appear on this for the second time.
Yeah. But make sure you add that last part in. It really helps us so that we can track where those visits are coming from. Until next time, bon voyage.